Pleasure to be here, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. This is the type of room that I do like to talk to, because at one point I was a scientist, I was a microbiologist. I was sitting in a dark room with a microscope, a room about this size, taking pictures all day long, and finally decided that my life wasn't as charmed as it could have been, and that it was time to leave science and actually start to write about it. And particularly writing. Even though I was interested in images, I'm interested in moving images, I'm interested in a lot of different things, it was writing that always kind of had the undertone of what I wanted to do. It was actually that I wanted to be a writer before I ever really wanted to be a scientist, although I was better at science. So that's how I ended up going through. And finally I got up the courage later on, or because of just the way things go, to get my writing skills up a little bit better and begin to become a writer. And in that process got interested in doing it, and got sucked back into academics to actually study journalism, to actually study science journalism, and how journalists actually do it. So all those different perspectives are going to come into my talk today as I try to go through it. Now I have way too many slides to go through for the amount of time, and I tend to go off in a few different little tangents, and I'm going to leave it to you guys on some level to do some work to try to bring things together and also ask me questions. So we'll see how far I get. I'll stop at times for discussion, and we may not get through everything that I have kind of prepared. But basically, I run the Concordia Science Journalism at Concordia Journalism, and basically our focus really is on the role of science journalism in Canada. We do journalism studies, and specifically we don't do communication studies and communication theory, but we're specifically interested in the role of journalists, and the democratic imperative that's implied behind it, and what they might do. We focus on science reporting particularly. We try to develop some practical tools for journalists that do things, and I'm also interested in deliberative public engagement as a part of that. This is all just to give a little bit of an introduction for those that want to know more about me. But really what I'm interested in things like this. Scientists try to determine why Ozzy isn't dead. This story, as soon as I saw it, really interested me. Interested me in the sense of why it was produced this way, why the scientists felt this was what would get people interested, would entertain them maybe, would make them more literate about science, would do what? So what is it about this story that actually gets it out and communicates science in any ways? The Prince of Darkness has called his continuing existence a modern miracle. Who could argue with that? He is famous for many things, for his eerie scream, for his Satan worship, for his biting the head off a dove and a bat. But mostly Ozzy Osbourne has become famous for indulging in decades of near legendary substance abuse. Abuse that would vanquish most and surviving. Now scientists could find out why. Company is going on to sequence his genome to see one of the 60 or so, I guess, that have been sequenced so far, to see what might be different about Ozzy. Do you guys find this a good story? Somebody burned on your head? You shook your head. Why not? Point people out. It's in the back, sorry?
Sensationalist a little, like from the title.
Yeah, maybe a little bit. Yeah, is that bad?
Yeah, I mean, like it's not a scientific article. It's like regular publication. It's not going to be technical enough for me to enjoy, and it's not going to be informative enough for the average
reader to get much out of it, right? It might just get a quick headline, and it may not even get down past this. Scientists might find out why. Other people, does anyone like it? Think it's a good one? I saw some smiles. Any thoughts? Yeah. All right, how come?
Well, I mean, it presents a very technical research in a very enjoyable and familiar way. Like Ozzy Osbourne, we're doing research on this guy. Wow. Why not?
Yeah, fair enough. So I mean, they're doing some science on him. They're trying to figure some things out. They might be using it a little bit as a publicity stunt. You might wonder as a journalist whether the company just wants its stock to spike or something like that. But other people, how many genomes have you heard sequenced? How many different things have done it? And do you really want to hear more about this? Is it more interesting to say, well, let's map somebody's DNA that we've all heard about and wondered what he does. He may have not been an icon now, but for people around in the 70s when he was big, maybe he was. Yeah.
It also seems to know it's sensationalist. Like, I mean, we're biting the head off a dove and a bat. Like, that's just a basic grammar, and it knows it's a joke.
Okay.
So it's saying this is to be pure entertainment. It's almost like an Inquirer-esque. Like, it's not meant to be a hardcore news story. It's meant to be, hey, here's some fun information we can throw at you.
All right, so its purpose may be fun. It may have a little bit of science in it later on. It might not. It may just be, wow, this company's doing it, let's do it. So, and it's being blatant about that, or at least trying to, potentially. Whether or not, we don't really have to talk to the journalists of whether or not they thought that, but it really kind of reads like they're at least having fun with themselves, right, on some level, and kind of getting it done. Yeah. So this is what I want to keep in the back of your mind as I go through and kind of talk a little bit about my own experience, some of the things that I've gone back and forth with, some journalism theory, because we're hearing through theories about why this might not be good or could be really good, or might just be, one of these things that kind of disappears. And then bring it back to some practical tips and through that. And we'll see how much I actually get through. I'll try to go quick at times, Ask any questions you want. I'm very informal in this kind of stuff. Stop me if I go too fast. I do speak quickly at times. Was it a good science story? That's basically what I want you to think about as we kind of go through. Here's what somebody said, basically, in the 19th century about what science journalism, what communicating science was all about at the time. Suppose it's Halley's Comet. Well, first you have a half-page decoration showing the comet. If you're going to work a pretty girl into the decoration, so much better. If not, get some good nightmare idea like the inhabitants of Mars watching it pass. Then you want a quarter page of big type heads and a 2-column boxed freak containing a scientific explanation that nobody will understand, just to give it class. This is turn of the century idea of what basically the Sunday world thought of when it was doing science journalism. We've come a long way from this, but there still is a root in what is going to get people interested in science. What are we trying to do about it? How are we trying to communicate it? What makes a good story and doesn't? This is one description of what might make a good story. Some people have problems with this. Susan Dentzer, a very good editor for Health Affairs, writing in the New England Journal of Medicine, takes issue with health journalism and McDonald's journalism and all the things that people call it and kind of getting it together. All too frequently, what is conveyed about health and by many other journalists is wrong or misleading. Some distortion is attributable to ignorance or an inability to interpret and convey the nuanced results of clinical studies. In this case, they're really interested in medicine and clinical studies. And some is due to an uncertainty about the proper role of journalism. So this is questioning whether or not, of the 3 responses we heard about the first one, which of these is what the journalist should really be doing? Which of these, as us, as people who want to communicate our science, should we really be doing? Should we do them all, a bit of each? Is one more appropriate in certain areas? How do we communicate our science in a way that's meaningful and effective for people? Is entertainment enough for the Ozzy Osbourne study? Or do we need a little bit more? Do you need a what, in some ways? From all of this, there's a slew of critiques that people say about science journalism in particular and science communication that they get at, that they have problems with. And this is critiques that I've heard my entire life, some I had before I went into journalism. And on the other side, just quickly we'll go through what some of the journalists I've talked to, some of the people I know, would say in response to these things. Scientists I've talked to have said that a lot of communicating of science, a lot of science journalism has no educational context. A person can't just pick it up and read it and really understand what it's telling you very well. It's too episodic, it's journal-oriented. Something gets into the newspaper because it's published in Nature, even though it was discovered 2 years ago and it took them that long to get it in. But that day, because Nature published it and there's an embargo system that all journalists buy into, it gets into the newspaper. And it seems like news to people who don't know it was there. And it's oversimplistic and dramatic. That it gives a platform for people that aren't really qualified to talk about the science. That it misses breakthroughs. That it sensationalizes coverage to sell science. And that it misses the intrinsic worth of what you guys have been doing for the summer. It misses the worth of the science, of what it really should be, and what it really should be giving to society. It doesn't hit it. Some journalists will respond, I'm not here to be an educator. Go to school if you want to learn about science. I want to entertain you with Ozzy Osbourne. I want to go there. This is not the role I'm into. When I try to communicate my science, I have no intention of educating you. If you get some information out of it, fine. I'm not saying I believe in these, I'm telling you about the responses, some of what we've learned as we go. That episodic nature, sure, that might be true, but that's partially due to the pressures that you might even have felt in the lab this summer, or how you're going for, to really slice your science as thinly as possible. Instead of waiting 10 years, 5 years, 2 years to finish the study and have it a way that you could talk about authoritatively, you're pushed by the PR department of university. You're pushed by yourself. You're pushed by the fact that now media articles might help you get tenure at a university, whereas before it didn't. To thinly slice things, to not wait till you have the real answer, but to salami slice things and give them to the media to see if they'll report them. That it's oversimplistic, sure, maybe, but that's what people wanted. People want that in the newspaper, is what some journalists will say. Unqualified commentators get into these communicating things and talk about it, sure. Some journalists will say sometimes these people turn out to be right. Sometimes the theories that we won't let come up about science or the data that looks wrong turns out to be the right thing. So what if we never let them speak? Seminal breakthroughs? It's true, but so does everyone else. When I was in the lab, that little thing, and I finally left, I used to read basically journal articles on dictyostelium discoideum about how it moved left versus right depending on what chemoattractant we put next to it with a micropipette. And I talked to about 6 people in the world that were doing the same thing as me. And I tried to convince them that what I was doing was important in moving things forward. That's what I was trying to do. When I moved out of that and moved to science, which I'll talk about in a second, I would read more broadly. I'd read some journals in Nature, I'd read science, I'd read about 30 journals a week, going through about 600 articles and trying to decide what was in there. And I'd come back to the lab and go, oh my God, did you see that thing about that new antibody they discovered? And they'd be like, what antibody? I didn't see that in nature. Sure, journalism misses things, but a lot of scientists miss these things too if you go back and talk to them. This is what some people would say. Sensationalized coverage to sell products. That's true, but some journalists will respond, you're crazy if you think science will sell anything at all. We've learned in the newspaper industry over a long time that sports, education stories, and entertainment, real entertainment with celebrities, sells. Everything else we do because we think it's important for people to learn. I'm not sure I believe that, right? Because there's lots of specialty science magazines out there. That's some of the responses you get. The last one is that it misses the intrinsic worth of a scientific finding. When something is really important comes along, the newspaper doesn't pick it up and it just gets buried. That's true, but at least in communication, there's no absolute news values in the sense of something doesn't belong in a paper, it doesn't belong to be reported today just because it was discovered today. It was communicated because it was important compared to everything else that happened that day. The president gets assassinated today, sorry, we're not going to be communicating your science, we're going to be talking about the president dying. There's no absolute value in journalism, at least. Things are constructed day by day, hour by hour now, and now second by second, it's getting a little bit character, to decide what's most important in that moment. So that's the kind of things that the communication of science fights against on some levels and deals with. So how do we best balance all this to tell an important scientific story? Here's my kind of what happened to me as I moved across from being a scientist to being a journalist and writing for a few newspapers and writing for one magazine. When I was a scientist, I talked and talked and talked. I talked about my science, I got it done. When I became a journalist, instead of talking, I listened. I didn't talk very much at all. I just sat there. In this kind of a conference, I would have just sat at the back and took in some notes. At the end, I may have come up and talked to the speaker and asked them a few pointed questions. That's it. I took time as a scientist to cover the variables. As a journalist, I found that I would make snap decisions. I was at a conference. I was going to cover that abstract for the paper today. In 5 seconds, I'm not going to deal with any of that other stuff. The decisions were really quick. Originally in science, I was fond of caveats. I started to become fond of breakthroughs as a journalist in some ways. And you've got to be thinking back to the Ozzy Osbourne story, the whole idea about this, and the idea of what is a good science story. How do we find the science story out of it? That's what I'm trying to get you guys to think through as you go through this. Remember, I'm going in a lot of different directions, and I tend to be a tangential thinker. I write about the field for the colleagues when I was writing as a scientist, and I did do a lot of writing. You guys have probably done a lot of writing too. I didn't write necessarily for my grandmother or a neighbor or someone that doesn't know anything about it. I wrote for that colleague I was trying to convince that I wanted to do a postdoc with, or I wanted to reference my paper because I felt it was really important, or I wanted something to happen because they were working on the same thing. When I was writing as a scientist, I'd write from the simple to the complex. I'd write from what I knew, here's what the literature can tell me, here's what I know about the scientific topic, to what I've discovered. Here's the unknown thing that I've just put forward that wasn't in the literature before. When I moved over to being a journalist, I flipped in communicating my science in some ways. I worked from the complex, here's what's just discovered, it's super complex, here's how it relates to something simple in your life. I went backwards. I went from the unknown to the known, always bringing it back to what people know. And that was some of what I kind of transitioned through as I went in there, as I started to think about, what is this best story? How am I going to tell it in some ways?